right, thank you. So my second presentation today is more of a detailed case study on upgrading the UK network to digital, and more specifically what we then did with DVB-T2. So I'll just recap quickly where we were before we started digital switchover. I'll then talk about the rollout plan, how the UK realised and used the digital dividend, a little bit about the engineering that we had to undertake, how we addressed the questions of the viewing public, then, as I said, the introduction of DVB-T2 and some of the lessons learned and the current challenges that we have. So you saw this picture earlier in the day. Here's a slightly larger and hopefully slightly clearer version. But the spectrum, as I said earlier, was really very intensively used immediately before digital switchover. I've lost... Ah, no, we're back again. So as well as television in channels 21 to 68, and that's the sort of region 1 8 megahertz raster, so up to 862 megahertz. We also had spectrum for program making and special events, PMSE, in channel 69, and those are things like sort of radio microphones that might be used in theatres or TV studios, and in-ear monitors that news presenters use. And that's quite important, because if you don't have spectrum for that, then it's actually quite hard to make TV programs. So that was really the sort of scope of the problem that we were looking to deal with. I talked earlier about the sort of services that we had in analog. The analog services covered 98.5% of the population, roughly speaking. And we had digital multiplexes at a lower level of geographical coverage, but still very substantial. So our digital switchover plan, the planning started in detail following the Geneva 2006 conference. And it was a 4-year plan running from 2008 to 2012, and it was a regional plan. So it was absolutely the intent to clear region by region and learn as we went. It was more or less in sort of 4 phases, which kind of equated to roughly autumn of 2008 to autumn of 2009 and so on until 2012. Not exactly, but roughly that was how it was done. And you can possibly see from the from the way that the regional plan developed that it tended to be regions of lower population that had the switchover first, before towards the end going to the regions of highest population in the southeast of England, particularly, where a large percentage of the population live. As I said, we had a very large number of mostly quite small transmitters in the UK to provide a very high population coverage, and we had to re-engineer them all and build a few new ones in order to maintain the coverage. And of course we had to convert 26 million households altogether. So we talked a lot about the digital dividend. I will skip through this fairly quickly. So the 2 bands that were actually cleared in the UK were channels 63 to 69 and 31 to 37. The PMSE, which had been in channel 69, moved down to channel 38, so there had to be a lot of retuning of that equipment. And that left us with 2 distinct bands for digital TV, channels 21 to 30 and channels 39 to 62. Mostly we had still multi-frequency networks in the UK. There were some small regional single-frequency networks where there simply weren't enough frequencies to do the multi-frequency network. But the channels that were then cleared were those two bands that you can see highlighted in yellow there, and those were our digital dividend in spectrum terms. Oops, back again, sorry. So what did we have at the end of that? We had 3 digital multiplexes which had public service obligations. Those had 98.5% population coverage again. And we had 3 purely commercial multiplexes, which had about 90% population coverage, operating from a much reduced number of transmitting stations. In terms of the engineering project, this was the biggest single infrastructure project in UK broadcasting history, and it was funded by the broadcasters. Now, we talked a lot in this and I think some previous sessions about funding and so on. The reason that the broadcasters wanted to do this was precisely for some of the sorts of reasons we've heard, that the old analog equipment was getting very old and very expensive to maintain, and we were faced with either having to re-engineer that or funding the transition to digital infrastructure. And so the choice was made to, instead of re-engineering the old, to reuse that money to fund the transition to digital infrastructure. Overall project management or program management for this transition was provided by a company called Digital UK, which was a company set up specially for the purpose and owned and managed by the major broadcasters. Arqiva is the transmission operator in the UK. It's a private company, but it's essentially a monopoly provider, and so they did all the sort of heavy engineering. And then each of the broadcasters, because you're moving from a situation where you had analog stations and some digital operation, because you're going to a purely digital operation, we had to re-engineer our sort of workflows and encoding in order to go to a fully digital operation, which by then becomes the primary service. You haven't got the comfort of falling back on your analog transmissions. So, for example, that requires you to have increased resilience. So, what could possibly go wrong with that? So this is an example of some of the sort of engineering that was done. Mostly we tried to reuse transmitting antennas, but sometimes you couldn't reuse transmitting antennas, so you had to replace them. And in this case, rather than sort of erecting a crane or similar infrastructure to move a new antenna in place, this one's being lowered into place by helicopter. That's obviously very, very quick, but it doesn't work in all cases. So where it does work, it's a very quick and efficient way of doing it. So those sort of things actually went spectacularly well. We hadn't done heli lifts of antennas in the UK previously, but that all went very well. However, every major program has a problem, and that was ours. This is the Oxford transmitter, and it caught fire. Transmitters are not supposed to do that. Of course, it's 200 meters up, so there's not very much you can do. The fire brigade can rush up, and they sort of think about pointing their hoses, and they realise that they're not going to get there. So that just basically had to burn until it burned itself out, and that was a very sort of similar antenna to the one on the left-hand side. It was helicoptered into position originally, so the old one had to be helicoptered off, and a new one helicoptered in. That was just a manufacturing fault on the antenna. In fact, it was probably the fact that it was carrying both the analog and the digital services temporarily that caused it to overheat and catch fire. But that was the worst thing that went wrong. Viewing public, we've talked a bit about this already. So information campaign was managed by this organisation that I mentioned called Digital UK, which had a sort of quite a heavy set of both national and regional campaigns. Having a regional rollout does enable you to target things at a particular time, so you don't spend too much money on a national campaign. You spend it where it's needed at the time. And I think, as our colleague from the FCC mentioned, helplines were very, very useful. So I think our helpline took 2 million calls overall, not 2 million calls or whatever number it was in the immediate days before switchover, but 2 million calls overall during the switchover process. The other thing was targeted assistance for sort of particularly the elderly people and vulnerable groups such as disabled groups. This was actually managed directly by the BBC, and it was funded from the BBC's sort of core public funding, which is a license fee funded basis. It included supply of equipment for people that needed that, and it included people visiting their homes to install the equipment if they were unable to do it themselves. So overall, as it says here, about 7.1 million people were contacted, some of whom took up the offer of help, and as it says, that sort of netted out to be about 190 UK pounds per customer was the actual amount of spend on that. In order to put that into some sort of context, that's about the weekly minimum, same as the weekly minimum wage in the UK at the time. Originally, the UK's digital switchover was intended to be all DVB-T and all SD services. But by 2009, it had become possible to launch DVB-T2, which gave you more capacity for your multiplex, and therefore made it possible to have a sensible HD service launch. So that was what the BBC did. The BBC in the original plan for digital switchover had 2 multiplexes, and one of those we converted to be an HD multiplex, mostly simulcasting existing SD services, but in an HD format. We did that initially at all the transmitting stations that were already broadcasting digital, and one or two? No, about 5, I think. Yes, it does say 5. About 5 advanced sites, which enabled us to provide some coverage in places like London, which hadn't gone digital by that stage. And then after that, the HD service rolled out alongside the rest of digital switchover. So at the end of digital switchover, this is where we were. So that was autumn 2012. Just to complicate our lives, we hadn't actually cleared channels 61 and 62, which were really supposed to be part of the 800, at that stage, the 800 megahertz digital dividend. So that was done as a follow-up project at the end of digital switchover. And then the question really arose as to what to do with the dividend at the bottom of the UHF band, which the mobile operators didn't particularly want. So what Ofcom in the UK then decided to do was to allow that to be used to launch some more DVB-T2 services. So these were the 7th and 8th multiplexes in the UK altogether, referred to as, because they're purely commercial multiplexes, they're referred to as COM7 and 8. They had somewhat lower coverage, again, at 70% population coverage, but nonetheless very useful for carrying additional HD services. And the sort of final piece of completing digital switchover was that some additional multiplexes basically carrying local services at a city level were launched in the available remaining interleaved frequency spectrum. So there's around about 40 local services at a city level now running in the UK. Some of the lessons learned, I think one of the things that we were always very, very keen to do is say that this wasn't taking television away from people, it was giving them more television. That was really a sort of key part of the sort of information campaign that we had. Analog switch off sounds like a bad thing. Digital switch over sounds like a more positive thing. Certainly from a UK point of view, starting in the regions with smaller populations, learning what worked in terms of an information campaign, improving the information campaign as you went along, that was very helpful. And I think the focus on the vulnerable groups also helped to dispel a lot of the sort of anxiety about digital switchover and made it a much more comfortable process for people. Our challenge today is to clear the 700 megahertz band. This is something that is a live project in UK broadcasting now. Channels 49 to 60 are being released for mobile networks. That leaves us channels 21 to 48 still to provide broadcasting in. So a whole load of TV services that are currently in the upper part of the band are being moved into the lower part of the band. But that's not quite the whole story, because that lower part of the digital dividend, which had previously been used for the COM7 and 8 channels, that's now required for the top 6 multiplexes, the 3 PSB and the 3 commercial multiplexes. So COM7 and 8 are now having to move temporarily into some of that released spectrum, which is not actually required for mobile for the mobile operators yet. So for the time being, those multiplexes are being accommodated in channels 55 and 56. And those are single frequency networks because it's the only way that they can be accommodated. So I think just to sort of summarize that, one of the comments that was made earlier in the day was, try and do this once and do it right. I think the UK has almost definitely not done that. We've done this in a very sort of complicated way. And I think perhaps the advantage of being not absolutely first through this process is that you do have the opportunity to decide what your destination point is and go for that rather than doing this in a number of steps. We had sort of 2 or 3 different steps, each at 2 and 3 year intervals. It's not the ideal way to do it, in my opinion. So I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity to present here, and I'd like to thank some of my, thank some of my colleagues in the BBC and Digital UK and Archiva for the material that they contributed to this presentation, and thank everyone for listening.